We're back in the PITCHDECK podcast studio. We're talking about podcasting. We are now in the third lesson. This is week 2. Graham Brown and Anne.
Hello, great to be here. Still here.
Yeah, full of beans today, Anne.
Yeah, as ever.
How's your podcasting career going? Your very early, nascent podcasting career.
It has to be said, it is small steps.
Yeah.
And I'm still making progress, which which is great. But I'm taking step by step.
Step by step.
Step by step.
It's the only way to do it.
Step. But looking at the editing now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So we're going to have a session on that coming up as well. Editing. That's a tough one because it gets technical, and I think as well it can be overwhelming a little bit.
Yeah.
So we're going to get to the editing in the next session. Whilst we're doing that, I want to talk about one of the most commonly asked questions. Once you've got beyond microphones and editing, the next part is, how do I actually do it? So beyond the actual technical aspects, how do you actually conduct an interview, right?
Right.
So what do you do? What kind of questions do you ask? How long should it be? Do I give them the questions beforehand? What should we talk about? What's on limits? What's off limits? Is there a way I should structure my questions? All these kind of things. So maybe we can just start by talking about your experience of interviewing. Have you had much experience interviewing? I mean, be honest, are you...
No, not much.
Right.
And what's really interesting, I think, is that one of my, I believe, mistakes is to ask questions that are too long.
Right.
So I'm trying to force myself to shorten my questions and let the other person, speak more, shall we say.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, if I get nervous, I'll just carry on talking.
Yeah.
And
it's tough, isn't it? Because you can hear it in your head as well, like, just shut up, just get out of this somehow and ask the question.
Yeah.
But everybody goes through that, right?
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm working on as well is really listening to the answer that the person's giving and seeing whether, rather than the sort of fixed questions, what can I develop out of the answer that they've just given me? And just trying to sit back and really listen. And again, that's a delicate balancing act.
Why do you think that is? Why is it delicate?
I think it's delicate because when the tape recorder is on...
Tape recorder?
When the... when the recording has started, the tendency for someone who's beginning is to think, right, I've got this structure, I've got it all in my mind, I've got these questions, so I'll need to jump in sequence.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's a conversation. So the person who's sitting opposite you comes up with something that perhaps you're not expecting or that is really interesting that you then want to develop. You have to be alert to that. And have the flexibility to change course.
When you mentioned structure. When you go into a conversation, interview, what is that structure? What does it look like now? I know it's not necessarily your ideal structure, but it's what you're working with now. You're obviously working on it and trying to improve it.
So what I'm doing, I am trying to keep it as free flow as possible. But I look at the person and I think. And the story that I want them to tell, because I know obviously more about them than the audience would know. So it's that thing of, that's their story that I think is the most interesting thing. So it's pulling that from them, getting them to illustrate what it is about them that's different, that's interesting, that's immediate, that's compelling. So it's bringing that out in a way that it comes alive.
So that is a skill, and I want to talk a little bit about how that is doable, and not necessarily the only way of doing it. I'll talk about, for example, what I do, and then we can sort of look at what you do as well, and look at what kind of other people do in the industry, like interviewers, whether in podcast or professionals as well. You mentioned a really important word here, which I think we'll come back to, illustrate, because illustrate really means to paint a picture or to draw a picture, right? And we're living in the world of audio, but I believe a good interviewer should help paint pictures in the listener's mind, right?
Right.
And it's a really powerful thing because, when you're listening to somebody's story, you're listening to two voices, and you don't know what that person looks like. I mean, you may be watching the video version of this, right? But most people won't. They'll be listening just to the audio. So they'll be listening to Anne's voice and they'd be trying to picture you. What does Anne look like? You know, what's she wearing? You know, what kind of eyes does she have, and so on. This is what people think when they listen to a story. And often when you see, you know what it's like when you listen to sports commentators and then you actually see them, you think, they don't look anything like that in my mind, right, for the first time. Yeah. But we paint pictures in our own mind. And you can do that in interviews as well, the techniques for that. I mean, one of the things, just as a throwaway now, is when I talk to people in an interview and they've said something about their life, which is a pivotal moment, then I ask them to describe that scene. So, for example, Anne, you remember you wrote about leaving the corporate world and that day when you walked into your boss's office and you put the envelope on the table and you said, right, there you go, I'm out. I'm going to go and do my own thing. Just let's replay that scene. What was going through your mind, right? Those are the kind of questions that I would ask to help people paint a picture. What were you feeling? What was the experience like? Share that with us. Because that's the stuff that you can't necessarily get looking at a website, but you can in a conversation.
Yeah, that's the joy of sound, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You know, the picture without words.
Yeah, so it's our role as an interviewer to get that out. So I think it was a good start by saying drawing the story out of people. Drawing being a key word here, right? You're trying to pull that out of people. So let's start at the top. What is this? I mean, we talked about interview. What the context of interviews that we understand. Where do we see interviews generally? There's like the news and like interviewing politicians and stuff like that. Do you see what you do in a podcast as an interview?
No, I don't actually. I think obviously if you've got a very short space of time and you're interviewing, say, a politician on something that is, a pertinent piece of information that you need to draw out within 30 seconds. Right. It follows that kind of format where it's question, answer, short question, short answer. What I see a podcast as is more of a conversation and more of a flow where there's more time to build a more detail into what people are saying. Yeah. So it's not as rushed and it's not as clipped, and it's a more gradual process where you can really make a point.
You've mentioned some really good points there as well. Time, not rushed and not clipped. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about those a little bit? Because this is really important to what is a conversation, effectively, timing-wise. And you mentioned, for example, if you did the news politician interview, it would be 2 minutes, sound bites, boom, 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 3 questions, like, and Brexit, yes, no.
Exactly.
Give me the answer. But if I wanted to talk to you about your career, I can't get it in 2 minutes, right? So we've got to put a bit of context in there. We've got to sort of go through a bit of a journey, set the scene with everything. Time-wise, one of the questions people often ask is, how long should a podcast be? And timing sets the scene, doesn't it? If you do a 5-minute podcast, you can't really get much out in that time, right?
Right.
So you're going to rush it. So what are your thoughts on time? Do you have an idea about what have you heard from your research?
So from my research, people say about 30 to 45 minutes.
Right.
Or maybe an hour tops.
Yeah.
But sort of round about the 30-minute mark, I think, would be a common theme, because I suppose what people think about is, where are people going to listen to this? Mm-hmm. They're going to listen on their commute, and how long is the average commute? Are they going to listen in the gym? That kind of thing. So you just kind of think in those time slots. Yeah. So something that would fit easily into that. So what do you think, Graham? How long should a podcast be?
See, I have an opinion on this, which may differ from the general public, which is that, again, I think 30 minutes is like the minimum. 45 is about the sweet spot. 45 to an hour is really like sort of that zone that I want to get a podcast in. But I've done like 2.5 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and people look at, people say, what? Wow, or what? That's the reaction people have. And I think the point is that we often, I think, worry too much about where people are going to listen to this. And the point being is that, if you worry about the general public and how they consume podcasts, then you'll end up editing all the good stuff of your podcast out. You know, what you need to do is indulge the people who are really into podcasts, and those who are really into it. So, you know, they want an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours even. I'm not suggesting you go there, but build up to that. But if you look at the most popular podcasts now on iTunes, so if you take Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss, who are the two most popular podcasts, their podcasts are about 2 to 3 hours long. So,
of course, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that we do that, but I think it goes to say that there is an audience for that. So I often think, why? You know, why are people listening to 2 to 3 hours? They're not listening to 2 to 3 hours whilst they're at the gym or, you know, whilst they're doing the washing up. I think people are consuming it as entertainment, you know, maybe when they're not doing anything else, just sitting and listening to stuff. Or, you know, maybe they're in the car, just driving around. So not worry too much about where they listen to it, but indulge the people who are really into it and not worry about the people who say, oh, I don't have time to listen to 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So the key, I think, with the length is that make the length as long as you want it to be and not edit yourself to the critics who say it's too long.
I think that's an incredibly insightful point, because if you're all the time thinking about a time slot, it's going to come across in what you're doing, and you're going to shorten things too much. Yeah, so that's an interesting exercise. Just let it
go,
flow, and see how it goes, and forget about the time. Yeah, you know, yeah. I'll
see what comes out of it. Well,
yeah.
Exactly. You'll find a length which works for you. You may say 30 minutes, 30 hours. I mean, there's a 5-hour podcast as well, which is a history one, which Neville listens to, as an example. But it goes to show there's an audience.
Yeah, and people will just break it down and go back to it. Yeah.
The reason is, this is the key part, and this comes back to like the nature of your interviews and what you do in your conversations, is that, you know, we live in a world where, you know, people don't have time for anything these days, like 8 seconds attention spans. And people, you know, like the headlines, it's the headline or nothing. You either get the headline right on the article or you're done, you know, no exposure, no attention whatsoever. So people don't have time for anything these days. So I think we live in an attention-starved world. Therefore, you know, there's this pushback on the other side, which is, you know, why do people like sitting and having a coffee, you know, in real-world environment, face-to-face, having a chat? Why do people like listening to podcasts? Why do people still crave that human touch, you know, rather than everything that's digital, online, you know, fast, 8 seconds? I think podcasts are the pushback on that. So that when we do podcasts, we should be conscious of that. When we do an interview, this is a conversation that doesn't exist in people's lives anymore. That's what we're trying to bring back, rather than 8 seconds of insight.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it is, you know, there's so much sort of jockeying for our attention at the moment, and trying to just slow it down a little bit and slow yourself down a little bit, so you're not jittering from one thing to another. I think it's just a great exercise, and drawing out an argument or a discussion or just a point of interest is a wonderful thing to do.
Well, let's talk about that. When you go into an interview, so you've done a few practice sessions already, you've done one real interview as well. And do you go in with a set of questions? How do you go into that knowing that, okay, I've got this much time, these are the things I want to ask? Do you have your like 6 questions, 10 questions? Is your list a running order? What do you do?
I tried not to do that. And I'll be honest with you, I would have loved to have done it, really, because it would have given me a structure and it would have given me touch points, which is very comforting, because you think, right, I've got my 6 questions, I can break it down, you know, to question 1, question 2, question 3. In reality, I had in my mind, 3, 4, 5 questions that I wanted to ask, but I wanted to get that magical flow going as well. So I tried not to be too rigid. And when I listened to it back again, obviously it needed, it needs a lot of work, and that is something I'm going to have.
What do you mean it needs a lot of work in the structure?
I felt that the person I was interviewing, I could have given her more time. To your point, where I was kind of thinking, we're under a bit of time pressure here. Let's try and do it all in 30 minutes.
That comes out, doesn't it?
And it does come out, and I think it did come out. And she had, and I had quite an ambitious sort of scope for the interview. So I wanted to start with something that happened in her childhood. So she was a child that came from Italy to the States. So I wanted to draw out what it was like to be brought up in a family where she effectively remained the only English speaker, had to be doing accounts at 12, and things like that to help her family out because their English remained very basic. And then, she married a guy from Asia and went to a place that her parents had never heard of. So it was bringing all of that out. And then she got herself into a job where she was welcoming, thousands of people from different countries coming into Singapore. And so it was trying to get all of this out of her, and also with the emphasis on perhaps you could give us some advice, if for people who are starting anew or coming out of one community and going into another. And I just think it was probably too much.
What was too much? The ground you wanted to cover?
Exactly, the ground I wanted to cover. And I would have been better either making it longer or focusing on one aspect of it.
Because that was her whole life.
That was her whole life.
30 minutes.
It was, yeah.
So did you know that background before you started?
Yes.
Okay, so you were aware of what was involved.
I was, yeah.
And you went in and said, right, I want to talk about this scene first, and then I want to move on to advice and, how that sort of developed. So we'll maybe start with that childhood part. And did you actually have a chronological map in your head?
I did, because I'm quite linear.
Yeah.
So it really was that, right, let's start here, and then you did this, and then you did this.
Was the start the actual start? Yes,
the start.
You're 5 years old.
The start was her being carried into a house in Michigan.
Right.
That's her first memory in the snow. And she'd never seen snow before. So
it's a nice picture.
It was a great picture. Yeah. And that was the start of it all. Yeah.
Those are powerful scenes to depict. When you get to describe them, and not seeing snow ever. There's a lot of emotion there as well. I think that when you sit with the right person in an interview, a conversation, you work with those scenes and indulge those more. Because the bit about the advice, I used to do that as well, ask, okay, can we give some advice at the end? And it always seemed like the advice was a bit sort of like a wind down on the story. Whereas what you then do is you ask them to flip into sort of a logical mode, whereas all these sort of stories they've told are quite emotional. And that's what people really want to hear. And when they say, okay, so can you give us some advice for people who are just starting a business in technology now, for example, they don't really know. And so they sort of switch into that sort of logical mode. And I feel like, that was sort of a weak ending when that beginning part with those stories, they were really powerful, really deep. I just wanted to indulge those a little bit more. And the advice would come out of that. And I don't even think people listen for advice. That's the other thing. That's what I kind of learned from interviews. People listen for the stories. The stories are the lesson, in a way.
Yeah, and I just wasn't attuned to that enough. Because she was a good storyteller, and I ruined it in the middle by asking her a very direct question, which she then struggled to answer because
what did you ask?
I think I asked it to something like, what advice would you give to, what's your top 3 pieces? One of those awful questions, and it really threw her off a narrative, and she struggled. And what we, I said straight away, let's not worry about that now. Let's get back to. Right. But it was too late. Obviously, I'd thrown the hand grenade into the interview. I'd done that myself.
That was a good test.
It was a very good
good experiment, right?
And it's also doing things like that and not preparing the person.
Right.
So I think if I was going to do anything that was, something perhaps where they would need to be prepared, even if it's just one question, you know, I would say to them, I will ask you, you know, something like, you know, what are you reading at the moment? Or, you know, I kind of ask them that beforehand. But
then they don't look stupid when they're digging around for the answer. Because they may know, but they just on the spot might not be able to come up with an answer.
Exactly. And then panic, you've got that awful side, you know, when they're just looking and, you know, I don't know what to say.
The lights are on, but
but there's nothing coming out of my mouth. And that can be, and it's a shame because that overshadows what can be a really good interview. If somebody's completely thrown by a question, so you've got to be sensitive, I think, to that you know your questions are teasing things out rather than completely slamming them in the face.
What do you, I mean in that context? You were asking your interviewee, if I can call her that, your guest, you know, very sort of personal questions as well about her life and where she's been, and stuff she's happy to share, obviously, because she has done publicly. How much of yourself did you talk about in that, just out of interest? Is that something that you thought, oh, okay, I can talk about this now, or did you just want to focus on her?
I wanted to ask you about that, actually, Graham, because I think there were crossovers in the interview where I also would have a similar experience. You know, I mean, I'm the child of immigrants. That I you know, I could have come in there with a bit of a story myself. Plus, I've been new here, and you know, and spoken to people who are also new. So within that interview, there was a lot of me that could have come out and did not. And I just wondered, how much do you think you have to put yourself into an interview, or does it depend, or is it always good to reveal stuff about yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that over time, I've learned that the more you reveal, up to a point, the better the interview gets. The reason is because if we're having a conversation, we're having a conversation, not an interview, right? So if it's an interview, it's like, okay, and question 1, question 2, right, question 3, okay, this is all about you. I think that if then... Oh, so you remember when you came to Singapore and you were like, you know, it's a struggle when you move to a new country. Well, I've just moved to Singapore myself as well. And, you know, I had to get my boy into school and, you know, we had to sort out our employment passes. And, you know, if you can drop this into conversation, a couple of things happen. Firstly, I think it builds a relationship with that person, and therefore they might feel more comfortable to reveal more about themselves. There's also the bit, I mean, if you show that you've made mistakes as well, it then creates the, you know, the playing field for them to do the same. So, for example, my first company was a disaster, you know, with my best friend. That's the worst thing you can ever do. Never start a business with your best friend, but you know, I didn't listen to advice. And I started that, blah, blah, blah. So you could tell those kind of stories. And then they know, okay, it's safe for me to tell about my screw-ups as well.
Yeah.
That's a good part of revealing it. And the third part, and this is the bit I think most podcast hosts don't get and are kind of learning, is actually, even though you're interviewing a guest, the podcast's about you. That is really important. And that's what I've kind of learned, because I'm not sort of the person that wants to push myself out in the public spotlight, you know, as much as maybe people think I do, but I'm not. I'm quite a little bit sort of reserved in doing that. But the common thread in all the conversations you have is you. So if you do 20 podcasts and we don't learn anything about you in that process, I think there's a huge missed opportunity. So you should be dropping things into the podcast about you so people know, like, oh, okay, where are you from? Like, say, you know, like you're from York or Derby or that kind of area. And, you know, when I moved from Leicester to Singapore, you know, these things you drop in conversation. Or, you know, when I met my husband, or, you know, when I climbed Mount Everest, or, you know, these things that people know about you, like you're into running, for example. Like that's something you can drop into conversation as long as it made sense. You know? So I think this is really important because you're trying to create a connection between the listener and you, not necessarily the guest.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. But it's a relationship, isn't it? Yeah.
So that's what we've got to work on, because it's not natural. I mean, we can sit and interview a guest week in, week out, and the listeners know nothing about us. And I think that's, they know our voice, but, where they're from, what do they do? What are they into? Those sort of things. These are the kind of bits, the tidbits we can drop in conversation to help build it. So to answer your question about how much you should reveal, I think you should, and it's not natural to do it. We don't feel as an interviewer we should be doing it, because you watch it on TV, don't you?
Yeah.
And you never expect like a famous interviewer like a Larry King or a Paxman to say, oh, this is about me. But this is not that. This is a conversation. So do you think that's something that you can do? Do you think?
I actually, yes, I think it is. I think with certainly, if you're interviewing somebody that you're so interested in their story, and there are, and if they've got any, it will flow, the conversation will flow, and it is natural to bring in some examples from yourself as well. And I think, it's working at making that sound natural.
Yeah.
That's
without
what that,
sort of, oh, by the way.
Exactly.
Let me tell you about this. It's
Yeah.
keeping it on point. But there are hooks, which you can kind of get into the conversation. Mm-hmm. But things that you're really passionate about. I know you're really into running. Yeah,
I am. And running is such a wide topic, and it's such a joy as well, because it doesn't matter. In the end, you're only competing against yourself, unless you are super elite. So somebody's 5K is somebody else's half Ironman. It's.
What's your distance?
Well, my distance is 10K.
10K, that's your preferred?
Yeah, that's my preferred distance.
What's your PB?
Well, my PB's about 46 minutes.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Well, and I might add, I didn't do a PB until I was in my mid-40s. So
I like this.
My real passion, well, not my real passion, but it's the interesting thing is, people who are still competitive as they get older, because obviously you can compete in your own age group always, and then there's people who come back after injury as well. So for me, this year has been a complete write-off because I had knee surgery. So a lot of what I'm doing now is that 46 minutes. Would I ever get anywhere near that again? Who knows? Probably not. But
never say never.
Never say never. Exactly.
Because I think it's in you.
Yeah. Well, so and a lot of running is in the head rather than in the body, and but it does require getting off your backside and doing the hard work and in the gym and pounding the pavements.
Do you? Talking about running, like trying to describe it to a non-runner, what would be? Have you ever had that moment when you're running where you just have those kind of Zen moments when you just kind of look around and think, like, this is all happening right here, right now. It's a bit surreal. Does that happen, or are you just completely suffering for that 46 minutes?
It's funny. I love running for mainly for the social side of it. So I'm a very sociable runner. I run with people.
You mean you're talking all the way?
I am one of those people. I don't listen to music, but I do a bit of talking around the way. But so for me, running alone or running in silence does force me to reach inside myself a bit more. But what really surprises me is how the ideas that come to me when I run that do not come to me if I'm just sat on a bus or walking.
Ideas like what? You mean in business?
Absolutely, really? Yeah. Business ideas, social ideas, life ideas, and I really start putting the conversations and everything. And I feel I can do it. And then I stop running and, you get caught up in other things. And suddenly, I lose a bit of confidence. But I find when the rhythm of running and thinking opens your eyes to possibilities that don't necessarily occur in, if you just sat at a desk or looking at a screen. And that's my Zen moments.
Yeah, the zone.
The zone.
I find when I run, one of the challenges that I have, Anne, is that there's a voice in my head. and it's there, and it's like, well, just stop at this bit.
Oh,
And that, I think as I've got better and better at running, I've become better at dealing with that. Or maybe it's the other way around. The better I've got at dealing with that voice, the better I've become at running, because, even, the longer you run, actually it's not that hard to run long. It's hard to run hard. And for example, if you go and do a 5K race, I think 5K races are one of the hardest races to run, because you start that race and you're full out straight away, full pace, hit the wall, there's no going back for 20 minutes, right? And I find that's really hard, because there's a voice in my head saying, right, just stop, just slow down, like go and be sick in that bush over there, right? Yeah. And I found that has been the real challenge, because physically I'm there. I think I can, no problem running, and I can run probably as fast as I can go. I just need to deal with that voice. So in a way, it's like, I've tried meditation and all those kind of things, but actually running for me is the only way that thing turns off. There is no off button. A sit, do the meditation doesn't work, because there's 100 things going on, but I'm out there running, it just falls away. Yeah.
For me, what I love, I particularly like racing, actually. Oh, yeah. Because there's a lot of areas in my life where I'm not competitive, but I'm very competitive in a race.
Right.
If it's in there, it will come out, and I love it. I love the, overtaking people, getting a time, bettering the time.
Sprint finish.
Well, my sprint finishing's shocking.
Really? You want to do some squats in the gym.
No, and it's all the talking and not enough gym work. But the whole race thing. So, but that gives me the discipline. Because when I'm running alone, that voice in my head is deafening. Oh, you can, just slow down, stop, or, you don't need to do the full circuit. And I have to really work hard to do anything alone that is better than what I would do with a group. Because the group just motivate me to move on.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I always love, and my only advice to runners, beyond doing the work, is run with people who are faster than you.
Yeah.
Because if you start running with people who are slower than you, will jog with them. So if you want to get anywhere, if you want to start a progression, then you have to run with the boys, run with the big boys.
With the pack,
and they will keep you going.
Yeah, and I think run with people faster than you. And one of the things I've learned, faster and older, because then there's no excuses. If they're faster and younger, then, well, he's just like a kid.
That's true.
Faster and older, then you've got no excuse. Yeah. They shouldn't be leaving you behind. And I think that's so true in life, isn't it? General, like in business, like surround yourself with people who are better than you. If you want to learn, whether it's running or cycling or, learning to play a guitar, surround yourself with people who are really good, and you will absorb from them and you'll raise your game. How important that is. And that's why it's so important, I think, in business as well, like hanging around with people who are good in business, because then what becomes normal in your mind changes, right? For you, 46 is completely achievable on 10K, right? But there was a time when maybe you thought breaking 50 was
breaking 50 was huge for me. Yeah. Absolutely.
But then you surrounded yourself with people who are probably doing that all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. And then it becomes the norm. And then you're looking, before you know it, you have become so much better. Because you just didn't sit there and think, well, I've broken 50 and therefore that's it,
They're all doing it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about running, which is great. We could go on forever, couldn't we? But the point being is that I think, for example, in this, if we take this as an interview or conversation example, is that what will people come away and remember you or me as or about? Running will be probably top of that list, right?
Right.
Right. And they say, oh, yeah, no, you're really into running. So next time they meet you, say, oh, and the runner. Right? Yeah. They've already put you in a box in a good way. Uh-huh. And if they're into running as well, there's a connection there as well. And I think in an interview, about conducting an interview, is that to indulge that, we could have gone on.
Yes, of course.
What race are you running next?
Exactly.
What are your goals? How are you dealing with knee surgery? Mm-hmm. How does that feel? Tell me about your frustrations, and all of that. Yeah. How is running a part of your identity? And that may just be like one of 10 questions that you have on the list. And I think this is a mistake podcast hosts make, is that they have all these questions and they assign them democratically or proportionately. Whereas, you know, there may be like that one question, let's talk about running, that may just be 80% of the whole interview. And that's what people will come away with. And I've understood so much about you through running in a short period of time, because you've told me that you're competitive, you're social, you're not naturally a competitive person in a normal environment, but it all comes out. You don't listen with music, you've got, you know, knee surgery. We learn so much, right?
Right.
And that could go into so many different areas. Like, did you run back in the UK? You know, have you started running since you came to Singapore? So if you can think about, you know, try and find that core area and double down on that. Indulge the question. So I guess you don't necessarily know which question is going to be the right one with that guest. But if you feel like, oh, this is really interesting, I want to talk more about that, my advice would be to anybody is that, you know, drop the other questions. You know, rather than steamroll your way through to the end, just let's get into this question, zoom into it, because this is what we need. This is where it's all kind of opening up and we can learn about Anne. So, yeah, in terms of, you know, the whole structure of an interview is like, you know, indulge those key moments and don't be afraid about just doing one or two questions. So that'd be my advice.
Yeah, that would be that's great advice. And actually, I think once you start practicing interviewing as well, then you can relate that back to interviews that you've already done and think, oh, where would that approach have worked in this interview, and would it be a better interview if I'd done that? And in my mind, you know, thinking of the interview that I did last week, it would have been a much stronger interview if I'd done that rather than try to rush it through, you know, 6 or 7 different life stages.
Well, instead of like you said, for example, jumping out and asking that advice question, where could you have gone with that interview if you wanted to expand a little bit in terms of that story? Would there be sort of was there a natural progression where you were talking about her story and her life and where she had moved and so on, and then you sort of jumped into the showstopper, which is like, give me your 3 points. Instead of going that way, would there be did you have any options to take that in a direction, but you thought, okay, no, I've got to move on, I've got to get to the next question?
I think what I should have done was develop the story and about her feelings, especially around her leaving America to come to Asia and marrying somebody who was from a very different culture than her parents. You know, not only not Italian, not American, came from Malaysia, somewhere they'd never heard of. You know, and I mean, not they'd never heard of Malaysia, but certainly Singapore was not somewhere where they knew where that was on the map. And I think it would have been really interesting exploring that aspect, but in how she felt in terms of the tie to her family versus her new life with her husband, and really bringing out that.
So when you talk about it in those terms, it's almost like you could tell the story as any Hollywood movie or a book, as some fiction novel is written like that, right? I mean, what you're describing is no different from so many stories out there. You know, that sort of leaving of one place and, you know, the family differences and so on. But the terms you're talking about it in are ones we're familiar with. Like you're narrating a tale which we're familiar with, right? With many different twists and turns of different actors and so on. But I think not to be afraid to look at it in that context, that you're telling a story, you know, and this could be a Hollywood movie, and you're a director of that movie and you're putting it together. You know, and you're putting the scenes together for the listener in a way. That's how I kind of see a lot of the interviews that I do. You know, I'm like directing a movie in some cases.
Of course, yeah.
You know, and sometimes I look for, you know, for example, there's a movie, the opening scene, there's a dead body, there's a gun, and there's a diamond ring next to the dead body, and then it's like, how did we get here? Those kind of like, there's your thriller.
Yeah,
I know you're a fan of thrillers, right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, rather than start with, okay, this is the day that they were born and we're going to go to the, you know, today, a director will pick that sort of point in the movie which challenges everything, and you've got to work out, how did we get here? and rewind back those steps back in that story. So in telling a story, for example, if we were to tell the Anne story, find that pivotal moment in your story. That could be when you came to Singapore, or it could be when you did your knee in, or when you climbed Everest or whatever, and then work back from that. That how, because that's really interesting to the listener. So, you know, you came to Singapore, like, why? It's like, so there's a story that leads up into that, right? So rather than sort of work chronologically, start with the opening scene and then try and like build that, you know, with all the sort of the why questions that go into it. Because I think that's really important. You know, one of the big takeaways from today in terms of conducting an interview is why. You know, if you can help get that why question out, that's the story told.
Yeah, because that would have definitely made this a much stronger interview, the one I did, if I had actually started at a completely different point in the narrative. You know, because I started at the beginning, and it's not that it wasn't interesting, it just made it too sequential.
Right.
And I think had I started somewhere else in the story, then we could have worked exactly that, work backwards, work forwards, and it would have been much more interesting. And I think, and I did a very long introduction as well, and I lost the will to live halfway through the introduction. So, you know, and it was too late. I was on a roll.
Good self-awareness there.
I was like, oh my goodness. So, you know, that.
Why did you do a long introduction? Was that just what you thought it needed?
I thought, you know, I got a bit. I think the big problem I'm finding with this whole podcasting adventure is the why. What do people want to hear, and why am I doing this? And I'm getting too het up with that, you know, because I'm thinking, oh, should I approach it from this angle or that angle, or is this the interest, is that the interest, or what's the hook that's going to pull people into this interview? What are they going to tune in to hear? What's the one good nugget of, you know, if I had to summarize this, what am I trying to summarize? And I tried to do a summary to start with. So, you know,
did you actually do it live, or did you do it after the interview?
I did it live.
Oh.
Which is why it went wrong. Yeah. And I think it would have been better to do it, of course, afterwards. Then you can bring out the context that, because you already know what's going to happen. But I did it live, and it just went on, and it wasn't very exciting. I won't do that again.
Yeah.
I learned that lesson.
It's a good takeaway as well. I mean, if you are going to do intros, do them after. When authors write books, often they write the introduction last, don't they?
Yes, yeah.
You know, because it's the most important part of the book, but you're setting the scene. So you want to make sure that resonates. Because you don't know what's coming in the interview either. So it may be something else, a different angle, a different avenue that you go down. So you want to capture that. But even if you don't do an intro, you know, just to start with the basics. Have you thought about, I mean, just finishing up in terms of how to conduct an interview? Often the beginning part's the hardest, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. So how do you start on a good foot? Right. So
yeah. And I blew that completely, Graham.
With the intro?
With my intro. Yeah. And then I came in with as soon as my interviewee started speaking, it improved.
Yeah. So you want to get them to that point as soon as possible?
Absolutely. Yeah. But I felt, you know, I had to do this big introduction. Yeah. And obviously I've learned now you don't have to do that live. You do that at a different time. And also, I'd like some advice on that, actually, Graham. How do you set the scene instantly so that people are drawn in? Yeah,
I think you've mentioned it. Get them speaking as soon as possible. So I would do, for example, if we were doing a podcast. So this is Graham Brown. We're in the Age of Tech podcast studio. I'm with Anne Morgan. Anne, how you doing?
And then I'm getting that opportunity to speak that soon. Yeah.
So, and some of the questions I asked just to set the scene, relax them. It's important to relax the guest as well. And where are you from?
Yeah, so I'm from Manchester.
From Manchester?
Yeah.
Manchester. And how long have you been in Singapore?
And I've been in Singapore nearly 9 years.
9 years. When did you leave Manchester?
Oh, as soon as possible.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So when I grew up in Manchester before it was cool.
Right.
So
wait. Manchester was cool for many, many years back in the 80s.
Yeah, but just so actually left in the early 80s.
Did you?
Actually, yeah,
Oh, before it was
just as
getting
it was on the cusp of cool.
Smiths, New Order, and all that.
Yes, well, Morrissey was my neighbour.
Oh, Morrissey.
Yeah.
Was he on your street?
Not on my street. He lived down the road.
Really? Did you see him moping about? Like,
well, he went to the boys' school, but he's older than me, and I went to the girls' school.
Yeah.
And if you ever read what he wrote about his school, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And if I was ever to speak to him, I want to ask him about school.
Really?
Yeah.
So would you recognise him when he was like in the early days of the Smiths?
Very vaguely. I mean, he always had a pretty large pro fan. He always looked a bit different. And so it was interesting. We took a lot of things for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the Buzzcocks was our paper boy, and it's a bit like Manchester United as well. In those days, you as a kid, you could just go to the ground and chat to the players, and it wasn't the same as it is now, where everything is held back and there's a real barrier. It was much more fluid. Yeah, so I went from Manchester to Liverpool.
Oh wow!
So I didn't go
far. As an upgrade?
As an upgrade, I loved it. I have
really?
To say.
What you studied in Liverpool?
I studied in Liverpool. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I never lived in Manchester again.
Yeah.
But I go back frequently. To see my mum. But and I've really started to enjoy it in recent years. Yeah.
Because it's interesting, you've got a kind of a Liverpudlian accent as well.
Yeah, anyone who spends any time in Liverpool, and that includes any foreign footballer, will have a Scouse accent at the end of it. And for me,
was it Jan Molby?
Jan Molby was a legend
from your era, right?
Yeah, but my vowels got strangled on the M62, so somewhere between Liverpool and Manchester, confused.
There's a big story. Well, that you asked me the question about how I'd start. We've already got all of that out. I mean, maybe it's easier because we kind of know each other a little bit, and I know kind of like the parameters of where that conversation would go. I mean, Manchester, Liverpool, the Smiths, and so on. Mm-hmm. But deliberately knowing there's a bit of a connection there, and we can play with that. But the point about where you're from, you know more about that than me. You're the expert. So I can't say, you're not from Manchester, you're from Derby, right? I can't say that. I can't call you out. So everything you say is correct. So you're at liberty to just kind of like talk about that, and it relaxes the guest a little bit. And also on top of that, we learn a bit about you because you're sort of giving away information. Yeah. Like you said, Manchester before, it was cool. So that was sort of, you're throwing me a line because then you're saying, okay, that opens up the conversation. Cool, Manchester. Okay, we can talk about music and bands and all that sort of culture and so on. Mm-hmm. And then you talk about Liverpool and football and accents and so on. So it's important to read all that stuff as an interviewer and understand that, where that could go. Some people are really not open like that. So where you're from, Manchester?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. You're going to have a hard work with this person, right? But you're quite open and generous with your cues. You're throwing them out. When people are like that, sort of go with them. And then you sort of like explore that. And then you could find a hook to say, well, that's great because, one of the things we wanted to talk about was travel. I know you've moved from Manchester to Liverpool, but, let's talk about Liverpool to Singapore, which is a much, bigger transition. So, I would use those kind of introductions to warm up. Where you're from is a great starting point.
Yes, that's great advice. I'm going to go for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think you could. I don't think anybody's answer can be uninteresting, even if it's an uninteresting place. That's interesting in a way. If you say you're from Scunthorpe or Grimsby, so I mean, no offence to anybody.
Exactly, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In itself, it's like you're here. So how did that happen? So I think it's also a good starting point. So that's my way of doing it. It's not the only way. There's lots of hooks that you can, work with, common points that you can find, rather than asking somebody off the bat, so what do you do? That's often it's like that advice question. It can get people to pull back a little bit. Yeah.
Just a question I have. When you're interviewing people and they because of what they've done, do you, and that's going to be the core of what you're asking, but perhaps in the early part they're talking about more interesting things. how do you bring those two things together? I mean, move it on, or I suppose it's the topic of your podcast. You know, how do you decide what the topic of your podcast is going to be?
So let's sort of unpack that a little bit. If you're talking to somebody and they're talking about interesting stuff, like, you know, I lived in America and I moved to Malaysia or whatever as a kid, but you want to talk about what they do, is that right? Or
yeah. So say the subject of, you know, of your podcast is all about. I mean, for you, you know, the tech thing is just so broad based. I'm just wondering, you know, how you know, sort of flesh out the person.
Yeah, you know, it's a really good question because, you know, you say, what's the subject of the podcast? And I talk about tech, but it's about people.
Yeah.
If we don't actually get onto the tech, it can still be really interesting. And at the end of the day, it's something related to tech. You know, we didn't talk about, you know, the new Huawei phone or whatever, but we talked about them and, you know, their life and what they did and so on. And I think, you know, in a way that could be enough. So not to worry too much about, we didn't talk about big data. That's what we're meant to be about. But, you know, if somebody was sitting here as a big data expert, so how did you get into this? Oh yeah, as a kid, I used to watch Tomorrow's World on TV and all these kind of things. And, you know, my dad used to bring a telescope home, all those kind of things. I think even if you didn't get onto data science, you've done a good job of helping tell a story, right? And to the point about how do you sort of bring that into, you know, I've got this subject area, which for you, you're sort of still exploring, aren't you? This is like, you like this idea of transition, don't you? In like between geographically and also in career, like, you know, there's a certain point in your career where you may transition. You know, you may say, I'm out of corporate, I'm looking for my identity in the non-corporate world and so on.
Yeah.
You know, how do you sort of move it into that? Well, it should come naturally. Even if it doesn't get into that, I think you've kind of covered it. You know, for example, if we talked about you and your life story, that is about transition though. You know, all of that, what you've been through, you know.
Sure.
Isn't that a transition geographically and all of that? So, you know, we don't actually have to say, no, we're going to talk about career transition. We've kind of covered a lot of that. So the point is, like, indulge as much as you can and don't sort of force it. That's my advice. I mean, that's the way I do it, but it's not the only way of doing it, right?
No, but I think it's I think that sort of capturing the person and getting the story out of them is much more entertaining sometimes, I mean, most of the time, rather than trying to chop it on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm just, you know, and of course it's a skill as well. So it's just developing that skill.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, indeed. I think we've
yeah.
covered a lot of ground today. You know, the key takeaways is this is a conversation, and indulge the key points and help tell people's stories. And I think, you know, if you want, you know, quick tips, one thing I always sort of recommend to would-be podcasters is to find an interviewer that you like, you know, style, and try and sort of what, you know, they've mastered their craft, you know, and look at how they do it and how they ask questions. Find one that relates to you, you know, media celebrity or you know, radio reporter or a journalist or, you know, a writer who has a public presence as well and speaks. Find that person and look at how they do their interviews. So, I mean, for me, for example, there's two that I follow, which, I mean, I think they have a little bit of a negative reputation as well, but it's kind of why I like them. Howard Stern's one and Joe Rogan's the other one. And I think they're just phenomenal at what they do, their craft and how they ask questions, you know, and I think there's a lot to learn. So, you know, anybody out there who's looking for inspiration, go and find somebody who you really admire and look at how they do it.
Yes, that's great advice. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anne, for joining today. This is the second week, so lesson 3 from the podcast course, and Anne will be in the Facebook group as well, so we can see her progress and the before and after of the interviewing style. Yeah. Maybe we can put like number 1, the first interview you ever did, and then maybe measure progress. How about that?
Yeah,
hold you accountable.
Well, hopefully things can only get better. That's what I would say. You've got to start somewhere, though.
You have. Well, you know, you've been a good sport, Anne.
Oh,
thank
no,
you so
thank
much.
you, Graham. Fantastic insight. Thank you.
Good.